Chapter 13. Departure. Roland hopped away from the ruins of the Ice Palace with a smile on his face. He and his team had just faced certain death and come out victorious. He was happy, he thought. It wasn't a feeling he was accustomed to, but it struck him more frequently since joining with Tariq on these insane Greencloak quests. Bright shafts of sunlight broke through morning clouds in the east. They shot through the holes and into the crevasse of the hidden city, making the walls of ice flash and sparkle like diamonds. They'd found Suka, and not only had they survived, but so had the fragile ice city.
"That's right," Roland said to no one in particular. "I'm a verifiable hero."
He felt his smile fade as the group of Ardu men and women approached. About 50 Ardu with their animals had emerged from the city, but they were examining the great crumbling hole that had once been the majestic palace dedicated to Suka. The great polar bear was gone, and all that remained of the palace was a jumble of sinking ice. Roland's eyes tracked the crowd, trying to find a friendly face, or even a younger face, amid the group of angry adults. His eyes settled on a girl who looked just a little older than him. He tried his most charming smile. She frowned even harder. "Suka is gone," she said, in a voice so sad you'd have thought he'd killed her spirit animal. And suddenly, an enormous dog shambled forward to her side and let out some kind of demon bark. Roland stifled a scream. It was the most horrifying dog he had ever seen. Bloated and brown, its snout was blunted and pocked with whiskers, 2 overlong canine teeth poking out from beneath them. Its ears had been shorn off, and it had flat, flipper-like paws that slapped the ice unpleasantly as it moved. Roland shuddered. The group of stern-faced Ardu stood silently till Tariq came forward. "You will go now," said an Ardu woman with a seagull on her shoulder. She looked older than Pia, if Pia had never drunk the pond's water.
"We just—"
Roland started, but Tariq put a hand on his shoulder.
"We will go," Tariq said. "I am truly sorry for the damage. I am relieved your city is still intact, but I understand you revered Suka and the magnificent palace that held her. If there had been any other way, if there's anything we could do—"
"You can go," the old woman said. "That is what you can do. Go. Now." Tariq seemed on the verge of speaking again, but he hesitated, nodded, and began to walk, the rising sun on his left.
"Roland, Maylin, Connor, Abeka, Maya,"
he called, sounding like a father gathering up his wayward children.
"We go. Now."
As the mass of angry Ardu grew distant behind them, Roland finally felt able to speak.
"Did you guys see that dog?" he hissed. "I almost peed my pants."
"He means the walrus," Maylin said. "One of the Ardu bonded with a walrus."
"Ah," said Tariq. "There you go, Roland. You have seen a walrus." "That was a walrus?"
Roland looked back. The walrus was in front of the Ardu, still watching. Its howl barked again.
Roland shivered. "Creepy," he said. "I think I might not like walruses."
A few moments passed as they walked in silence, and Roland felt the ever-increasing need to bring up a subject besides walruses and his fear of them.
"So, what was with those guys anyway?" he asked. "Those city Ardu. I thought they were going to cut loose with seal spears the way they were looking at us."
"We freed Suka," Maylin said, "and destroyed the palace generations of their people had built."
"We didn't destroy it,"
Roland said.
"Suka did."
Maylin shrugged. "Part of who they are is gone, and it was our coming that made it happen." Roland saw the remembrance of Zhong burning in Maylin's eyes. He moved closer, till their shoulders touched.
"I guess," he said. "But I mean, what were they thinking a giant monster polar bear would do if it ever got out of that ice block? I would have put good money on smash, kill and roar.
The wind shifted away from the brutally chilly west to the colder-than-imaginable north. "Oh!" Abeka gasped, and Uraza disappeared, becoming a mark on her arm. "I want to get out of here and never ever return again."
"And how are we going to get supplies for our journey out of here?" Connor asked. "I'm afraid the Ardu villagers will be less than welcoming,"
Tariq said, as his otter flashed back into its dormant state.
"Because of the Ice Palace thing?" Rolan asked. "How could they know? I haven't seen any male ponies or male walruses or whatever. I bet they don't know that we're the horrible palace destroyers of doom." "Nonetheless," Tariq said, securing a rope around his waist, "we will be going directly west to the coast, on our own." He handed a length of rope to Maya. "Secure this around yourself. Then Abeka, Maylin, Rolan and Connor. Rolan and Essex have done a remarkable job warning us of crevasses, but I don't want to take any chances." "Do you think Tariq wanted me in the back for a reason?" Connor whispered to Rolan once they were all tied up and walking. "I didn't do anything to offend him, did I?" "It's probably just because you smell," Rolan said. "Huh," Connor grumbled. "You smell at least as bad as I do." "No, really," Rolan said. "I mean, like, your sense of smell is better. With your, I don't know, wolf snout powers, you might be able to sense if we're being followed." "Oh," said Connor, glancing behind them. "But probably also because you stink," Rolan said. After what felt like hours, Rolan could make out an Ardu village in the distance, a different one than they'd left, he thought. There were maybe a dozen people watching them. Rolan could see the glint of spears in their hands. "Can they see us?" Rolan shouted over the wind to Tariq. Tariq turned his head toward the distant village. "Probably," he called back. "Otherwise they wouldn't be holding spears." "They suddenly don't like us?" Rolan asked. "They must think we're someone else." "Or perhaps one of the Ice City's male walruses got through," Maylin said. One end of Rolan's rope was tied to Maylin. He tugged on it playfully, making her almost stumble. She gasped and tugged back. Hard. Rolan flew forward, banging into Maylin. She grabbed him, trying to keep upright, and he grabbed her, trying to keep from falling. And for a moment, they stood there, covered in leather and furs, and beneath it, two people who were, essentially, embracing. "Sorry," Rolan said. But she didn't let go. He turned his face slightly, and the openings of their hoods brushed together. Her face was very close. Instinctively his mind whirled, searching for something teasing to say. But Abeka beat him to it. "If you two are done playing kissy face," she said, tugging on the rope. Maylin and Rolan both pushed away from each other and began walking again. Still, Rolan kept one hand on the rope that tied him to her. About an hour beyond the last Ardu village, the wind began to grow so fierce that the snow it whipped up around them made it impossible to see more than a few feet. After Maylin crashed into Maya, hard enough for both of them to collapse into a heap, Tariq called for camp. Chapter 14. Maya. "It is amazing that I can find this comfortable," Abeka said, sitting propped against her pack as the side of the tent near her flapped violently from the winds. "I actually feel warm. Is that odd?" "Not so odd," Maya said, holding her hands over a hole she had hollowed out into their floor. It was now warming the space with a small fire, seal fat burning in a pan as they'd learned from the Ardu. All 6 of them were crammed together, but the others were sleepy from the long day, already dozing against the pillows of their packs. "That is incredible," Abeka said, leaning closer to the fire. She spoke softly, so their conversation wouldn't disturb the others. "All of our animals are fantastic, but what you do feels truly like magic." Maya flushed. "Thank you, but to me, what you do, what all of you do, is magic." "Summon our beasts?
You do the same.
Not that, Maya said, though I think what you do with that bow might qualify as magic. No, what I mean is how each of you can do this, all of this, and not be afraid.
Abeka closed her eyes. I think none of us are without fear.
Maya nodded. I'm sure that's true, but I guess
She took off her right glove and held her hand out to Abeka, palm down and low, as if worried someone else might wake up and see. Her hand was shaking. You're freezing, Abeka whispered. Put your glove back on. Maya smiled. Take my hand. Just hold it for a second. Abeka took Maya's hand in hers, fully expecting to rub some warmth into it, as Connor had done for her feet. But Maya's hand was as warm as if she was sitting on a beach in Nilo. I never really get too cold anymore, as long as Teeny stays warm. At the mention of his name, the little salamander poked his pointed head up from under Maya's scarf and darted back under again. Abeka looked down at Maya's hand in hers, shaking. She was reluctant to let it go. It was a comforting warmth to her own cold hands. But she also felt Maya needed something she wasn't sure how to give. I'm not cold, Maya whispered, her voice hoarse. I'm scared. She took her quaking hand back from Abeka and gripped both her hands together, as if trying to force them to be still. What happened in the ice palace? The bear, the roaring, the walls broken, the ice shattering, the screaming? She shut her eyes. I almost died. We all almost died. But we didn't, Abeka said, smiling. We didn't, Maya said, returning Abeka's smile with a sad one of her own. But something in me, I don't know. She looked at her hand, still visibly quivering. I don't feel... Her voice began to shake as hard as her hand. I don't feel right anymore. If anything else happens... Maya shook her head, flashed an apologetic smile, and lay down, her face turned away. Later, amid the sounds of sleep, as Abeka lay wondering how one could fix things that are broken on the inside, she heard the flap of the tent open and close. She sat up, wary of an intruder. All bedrolls were quietly occupied, except one. Mei Lin's spot was empty, the overcoat she used as a blanket cast aside. As Abeka began to shrug on her own topcoat, Roland sat up, looked at her, and then at the empty bedroll. Mei Lin, he mouthed silently. Abeka nodded, and Roland held up a finger, as if to say, wait. She did, but every second that passed she thought of Mei Lin out there in the snow, freezing without her coat. Finally she shook her head, twisted the toggles that would keep her outer coat on, and rose. Roland's finger became a hand, palm out, and then two hands. Hold on, he mouthed. A few seconds later, the tarp parted and Mei Lin quietly padded in. She lay down on her bedroll and began to snore. Abeka raised her hands, palms up, and mouthed, What? To Roland. He raised his eyebrows, shrugged, and dropped back into his bed. Abeka lay down, her coat still on, and crossed her arms over her chest. What was that? Did Mei Lin do that often? Often enough for Roland to know about it, obviously, but what did it mean? Was Mei Lin broken too? Abeka sighed. Obviously her brain was not going to let her sleep much tonight. She drifted, waking often at every noise, her mind trying to solve all the problems, Maya, Mei Lin, Shane, and the green cloaks. She must have slept for a time, because when she woke again, a faint glow bled through the tent flap. She wrapped her coat and bedroll around herself and went out, finding Connor sitting on his pack, Briggan beside him. It's peaceful, alone in the morning, Connor whispered, so as not to wake the others. I can leave you alone,
Rebecca started. No, sit. You're not company.
Thanks,
said Rebecca. I meant, said Connor, being with you is like being with family. You're someone I can relax with.
Rebecca sat. Connor laid his hand on Briggan, wriggling his fingers into his fur. Rebecca released Uraza, and the leopard stretched and yawned, showing off her sharp teeth, and then curled up on Rebecca's lap as if to get warm. She was much too large, spilling off of Rebecca's legs. Rebecca put her arms around Uraza's neck and lay her cheek on the top of her head. Uraza purred.
It's so bleak and cold. No sheep for hundreds of miles, Connor whispered. But the sun rises everywhere on Erdos. The sun is just as cheerfully yellow here as it is in Yura.
But muted, said Rebecca. I miss the fierce strength of the Niloan sun. She heard the rustle of movement within the tent.
Was it a dream that woke you, Connor?
Tariq asked from behind.
No, Connor said, fidgeting a little. Well, yes, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't significant. Tell me, Tariq said. No, really, Connor said. It was silly. It was like a shoe dream. I'm sorry, Tariq said, confused. We were on the ice and we all had weird shoes, Connor said, as if embarrassed but now committed to getting the story out. Yours were furry and had tails that moved. Roland didn't so much have shoes as tiny little wings on his ankles. Maylin had on boots that looked like dumplings, with really long green laces that seemed to trail behind us for miles. I see, Tariq said, the hint of a smile on his lips. And the dumpling shoes shocked you to wakefulness? No, not that. Connor glanced at Rebecca and back at his hands. Rebecca had, these fantastic slippers made from fire, which, of course, kept her feet warm but also started to melt the ice. She started sinking down, and nobody noticed but me. I tried to run to her, but my shoes, they... Yes, Tariq prodded. They were walruses, Connor said, like little foot-sized walruses with their tusks stuck in the ice. They wouldn't let me run. Rebecca fell into the water under the ice, and then I woke up.
If only it were true, she said. I could use a good bath right now. Connor smiled at her, but then he stared a little too long at her face.
Oh, you look terrible, he said. Rebecca rubbed her face.
Well, thank you. If nothing else, I can perhaps achieve perfect unpleasantness on this trip.
What? No, what I mean is, not that you... You look tired, Roland interrupted, emerging from the tent. I think that's what he means. Yes, Connor said. Are you okay? Did you not sleep?
Tariq had walked to the opposite end of camp and was staring intently at the horizon.
Roland, he called. Can you see the coast from here? It should be directly west of us.
I had difficulty sleeping, yes, Rebecca said. Maylin's night walking had me worried and up thinking for hours.
Wait, what? Connor said. Maylin was out walking at night again?
Yes, Rebecca said, without a coat even.
I can't see anything,
Roland called back to Tariq, and then he turned to Rebecca.
It's nothing. We've seen her do it before, and she doesn't like to be interrupted. Maybe it's a kind of meditation for her. Anyway, she always comes back. Is she sleepwalking? Said Connor. The Greencloaks say sleepwalking is a normal part of bonding.
Maylin is well and truly bonded by now, Rebecca said. A drowsy voice called from inside the tent. Okay, I'm up. Stop calling my name. Chapter 15. The Docks. The coast had been closer than Roland thought. Tariq assured them that it was only a few hours' march away, but Roland had been convinced he was just saying that to raise their spirits. But now they walked with the afternoon sun angled to their right, the salty sea air thickening the wind. They didn't get too close to the water, afraid of thin ice, but Roland's sharp eyes could see slate-blue sea and the sharp white cracks of waves. The goal was to get to an Ardu settlement and get a ferry to carry them to Yora. They had stopped their march for the moment, and Tariq was investigating something on the ground. Bug droppings, maybe. It seemed to Roland that they were stopping like this every few minutes.
"Are we lost, Tariq?"
Roland called, loud enough for everyone to hear. Essex, on his shoulder, fluttered her wings.
"No,"
Tariq said.
"Because it looks to me like we're lost," Roland said. "We are not lost,"
Tariq said. They walked in silence for several minutes, which Roland figured was a few minutes too long.
"Not that I don't enjoy a good walk around an entire continent of ice," Roland said. "But is there a reason we didn't just go back to where we crossed to get here in the first place? As nasty as it was, at least we knew that route."
And suddenly, Roland was attacked. What felt to him like a giant centipede leaped onto the back of his leg, skittered up his back, and clamped onto his head. Roland screamed. He was certain it was going to either eat his eyes or lay eggs in his brain or both.
"Get it off!"
he yelled, running in circles, too afraid to touch the thing with his own hands for fear of losing a finger to the thing's inevitable teeth. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the weight on his head was gone. He looked around and saw Lumio scamper up to Tariq and crawl into his coat. Then Roland noticed the laughing. Maya and Abeka were giggling, and Connor was bent over, laughing those deep belly guffaws. Colour rushed to Roland's face. Maylin wasn't laughing, but she was smiling, which might normally have made him feel mocked. But for some reason it didn't. Her smile made him smile.
"Yeah, so I thought Lumio was a giant carnivorous centipede,"
Roland said, laughing. Only Tariq stayed exactly as he was.
"We're taking a different route back to Yora and Greenhaven," he said, answering Roland's question as if he hadn't just scared the life out of him with an otter attack, "because I want to avoid Shane and his people."
Roland grunted.
"We have been stopping to look for seal holes," Tariq continued, "like the one over there. We are officially out of food, and what our animals have been able to scavenge will not be enough to sustain us."
Roland had mixed feelings about this. True, he was hungry, and while seal would not have been his first choice of meal, he didn't mind it. It was really the stabbing and the skinning he didn't like. There were kids on the streets of Concorba who would skin and eat rats, but just watching one of the other kids skin a rat made him lose his appetite. It seemed simpler, less cruel, and slightly less gross to get his food from garbage heaps. Unfortunately, there were none of those in Arctica.
"Is the great survivor of an otter attack going to restore his honor by spearing us dinner?" Connor asked.
Roland started, ready to bow out of the whole process, when he saw Maylin looking at him, and for some reason abruptly changed his opinion.
"Get me a spear,"
he said. And then they waited, and waited, and waited. Realistically, Roland thought, it had probably only been an hour from the short distance the sun had travelled, but lying motionless on the ice tended to make time pass very slowly. After another 97 hours, at least according to Roland's reckoning, he thought he saw some movement. Roland cocked his spear arm back. Something broke the surface of the water in the hole, and Tariq struck first, throwing his own spear at the mark, barely missing. There was a terrible cracking sound, and the ice buckled under Roland's feet, pushed upward from below.
"Get back!"
Connor shouted, and Roland did, just in time to see a demon emerge from the ice.
"Walrus!"
Roland screamed. He scrambled back, unable to do anything but point at the beast that had emerged from the ice. Tusks swung at Tariq, who darted to one side to avoid being hit, but his otter-enhanced speed did not match well with the ice underfoot, and his feet spun out from under him.
"Walrus!"
Roland yelled again, still pointing, still scrambling backward, but afraid to tear his gaze away from the thing. Abeka and Maylin loosed their spears at the same time, but they missed as the walrus charged. Maylin dodged, sliding into a roll that put her next to Tariq, who was back on his feet. Abeka skittered backward from the galloping behemoth as its bulk ploughed into her, knocking her flat on the ice. The walrus raised its tusks to strike, and Uraza flared into existence. The great cat let out such a roar that the walrus actually stopped. Briggan and Uraza both leaped, but the walrus slipped back into the hole with a splash. Roland's backward scramble had stopped when he hit a snowdrift, and as the walrus disappeared, he realized he was still pointing at where it had been. Maya was beside him, pressed against the snowdrift too, knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide. Her eyes darted to his. "Walrus," Roland rasped, voice hoarse from shouting. She nodded, and he dropped his hand, sore from pointing so hard.
"Well," said Tariq, "we would make terrible Ardu hunters."
They started on again. Roland was full of nervous energy, walking twice as fast as the others.
"That was not a seal," he said. "That was supposed to be a seal. That was a seal hole, but that wasn't a seal. That was not a seal."
At the next seal hole, they waited again, and were at last rewarded with a seal. No tusks, no charging, no walrus rage. Abeka's arrow struck the seal's neck. She knelt beside it and whispered, "I'm sorry to take your life, friend. My family here needs your meat to survive. I took a shot I knew was true and would give the least amount of pain. Thank you. In your death you have saved our lives." Everyone was quiet for some time after that. Tariq, Connor and Maylin busied themselves with cleaning and stripping the seal of its meat, parceling out chunks to eat now and chunks to carry with them. Maya put some seal fat into their metal pan and set it afire, though it was too small to cook over. Maya could sear the meat with her power, but could not maintain the flow of fire long enough to cook it properly. Most preferred to eat it raw, like the Ardu. Maya moved away, to stand alone and watch the sea, and Abeka went to her, putting an arm around her back. They travelled in peace for 2 more days, living off seal meat and 2 mutilated somethings that Great Essex hunted. Gradually, rocky land emerged from the ice, and another Ardu village perched on its southern coast. Roland didn't care about the boat, didn't care about crossing. He just wanted to trade them whatever property he had for a good chicken and potato stew, though a nice corn hash with sweet peppers wouldn't go amiss. But the village didn't have any chicken stew. They had seal stew, and seal brains, and some kind of crustless pie with meat that was probably pieces of whatever animal it was that Essex had brought them. So when Tariq suggested they just take the boat and be done, Roland didn't object. This boat was larger than their last ferry, flat and wider, low to the water and not full of quite so many dead fish. As the boat approached the coast of northern Ura, Roland began to discern the outlines of small buildings and familiar shapes. He sighed, relieved. These looked like the proper buildings of his upbringing, the kind that people who eat chicken stew might build. They clambered onto the docks, and Tariq pressed something into the hand of the boat's captain, which seemed to make him happy. The man bent his head and whispered something to Tariq, who nodded and walked over to the group.
"The captain has told me that something is wrong,"
Tariq said.
"Like it's warmer than frozen here, and it doesn't smell of dead seal?"
Roland asked.
"Like the dock workers are missing," Tariq said. "The captain said there are always people from the village here when boats arrive, to help unload cargo and offer goods and services."
He looked to the captain, who remained on his boat. He appeared to be waiting for something. "What does that mean?" Maylin asked.
It might mean nothing, Tariq said. It might be a holiday for them. The group visibly relaxed. Or it might mean the enemy is here, he said, and Roland heard Maya moan. Why's the captain just waiting there? Connor asked. We need to decide if we're staying, Tariq said, or if we're worried enough to go back to Arctica with the ferry. Turn back? Roland asked. To the ice and cold and walruses? No, thank you. That's one vote for stay, Tariq said. Maylin?
I say stay, she said. Turning back is not an option.
Connor? I actually think it might be smarter to go back, he said. Not for good, mind you, just, I don't know, this. He gestured at the empty dock. This all feels unsettling. Maya? Go, she said. Leave. I vote we go back. That's 2 stay, 2 go. Abeka? I don't know, she said, turning to look at the sea and Arctica beyond. It's so cold back there. She stopped, scanning the faces of Maya and Connor. She sighed. I am fine with either. Whatever you decide, Tariq. We stay then, Tariq said, and nodded to the captain, who began unlashing his boat for departure. We will stay together, Tariq said, looking at all of them in turn. If we cannot find transport in an hour, we begin to walk together. The boat began paddling away, and Maya kept pace with it on the dock. When she ran out of walking room, she stood there and watched it go. I smell sheepskin, Connor said. What? Said Roland. You smell sheepskin? That's just weird. It is, said Tariq, looking to the village before them. I haven't noticed any clothing made of Yoran sheepskin this close to Arctica. Roland saw Essex circling ahead, and his eyes drifted down to the top of a dock-facing building. There were people there, on the roof. The sun was just starting to fall behind them, making it difficult to focus. Shane, Roland said, squinting. And those imposter kids, that blonde frog girl, Talia, and Anna, the one with the lizard. I think maybe one other I don't recognise. And his mother. His entire life, an awareness of his lost mother had lain against his heart, like an arrowhead too deep to pull out, but he'd tried to forget her those long days on the ice. He'd tried. Roland took a few steps closer. There are a lot of people, Roland said, on all the rooftops. Archers, said Maylin. We're outnumbered at least 5 to 1, said Roland. He amazed himself by keeping his voice calm. I don't suppose they would just go away if we asked them nicely? Maya asked. She glanced back, and Roland looked too. The ferryboat was gone. Probably not, Connor said, his hands balling into fists. Maybe, Abeka said, and everyone turned to her like she had told a rude joke. Really, she continued. Let me speak to Shane. He can be reasonable. I have my doubts, Tariq said, but you're welcome to try. Don't go without Uraza free, Connor said. Abeka shook her head. Shane hasn't released his Wolverine. I would seem antagonistic if I didn't keep Uraza in passive. Abeka walked several steps forward and waved. Roland imagined he could see Shane smile, but he wasn't sure what kind of a smile it was. This is a bad idea, Connor growled. That guy is a weasel. The figures in Shane's group disappeared off the roof, but the others remained. I think we should stay with Abeka, Connor said, moving, in case Shane tries to pull something. We're close, Tariq said. I don't want to appear threatening. I rather think a peaceful solution is our best option with the current odds. Let's give her a chance. If something happens, she's quick enough to get out of danger, and give us a chance to engage. Connor growled again. I think you might be turning into a wolf, Roland said. Connor stared as Shane hopped down from the building's roof, waving at Connor like they were old friends. I want to punch that guy in the face, he said. Roland nodded. Some people do have faces like that, though I've been told mine is one, and I disagree. I have never wanted to punch myself in the face. Roland felt himself rambling. He shut his mouth and looked down, aware of Adana nearby, watching him. He'd left in the night. He'd abandoned her in Samis and run like a coward from an uncomfortable decision. I'm moving in, Connor said. Tariq raised an eyebrow. Just there, Connor said, pointing to where the dock planking hit dirt. I want to be on dry land. Okay, Tariq said. We all go, slowly. Just there, like Connor said. A respectful distance. Oh, Maya said, her eyes searching the water as if hoping for the ferry to return. No other boats were in sight. Tariq, I'm just going to sit over here at the end of the dock and watch the sea, okay? Tariq nodded, watching Abeka speak with Shane. They were walking slowly, almost idly. He's leading Abeka to those crates, Connor said, like a herder nudging his flock. Roland wasn't so sure. Connor was often jumping to conclusions, but they were getting farther away. They're coming back now, Tariq said. Shane and Abeka had turned. Abeka waved to get their attention. Good news, Abeka yelled over to them. They've agreed to a trade. A trade? What did Shane have that the Greencloaks wanted? Talia was suddenly beside Tariq, her hideous flat frog lying on the palm of her hand. You will give us the bear's talisman, she smiled coldly, and we will return Uraza to you. Roland frowned. Shane was next to Abeka, smiling as they spoke. Did he know what these two were saying? His hand was holding Abeka's arm like a gentleman might hold a lady, but his hand was directly over the tattoo of Uraza. Anna, her lizard scrambling around her ankles, spoke in a soft tone, so her voice would not carry to Abeka. Shane is too much of a diplomat, so Zarif made sure we came along and enforced the plan. He was especially hurt by Abeka's betrayal. We will return Uraza after we have cut her from the Niloan's flesh. Perhaps the Greencloaks can bind the wound and make the union fresh, if you are quick about it. Tariq had paled. Roland thought all of this talk about cutting Uraza away was rubbish, but Tariq seemed to be taking something about it seriously. Now, the girl said, holding out a sack. The talisman, please. No one moved. Shane looked over toward their group, still holding on to Abeka, his brow furrowed. Somewhere farther inland, a dog barked. Wait! Shane yelled suddenly. Without warning, Connor released Briggan. The wolf leaped directly from Connor's arm to on top of Talia. Her frog dropped to the ground with a splat. Anna's lizard hissed at the wolf, bearing needle-like teeth. Like everyone else, apparently, Roland was so distracted by Briggan he didn't notice Connor run until he'd crossed the space and rammed his shoulder into Shane's middle, knocking him away from Abeka. Leave her alone! Connor shouted. Other conquerors, several with spirit animals of their own, moved forward to attack. But suddenly, Briggan was there, and Briggan was huge. Connor was wearing the slate elephant. The wolf was the size of an elephant, his cobalt blue eyes cold with rage, his canines exposed with each mad bark. The conquerors lifted weapons, but Briggan swiped at the first wave with his paw, knocking them flat. Tariq whirled, sweeping the feet out from underneath Anna and Talia with a low kick, spinning into a leap that landed him directly behind them and ready to strike. As he did so, Roland saw a
bear of a man stalk from the shadows. He took 2 deliberate steps toward Tariq, clamped his arm underneath Tariq's chin and began to squeeze. Roland ran toward Tariq, unsure what he could possibly do against this beast of a man, now holding Tariq off the ground by his neck. As Roland sprinted, an arrow flew past his head, close enough for him to feel the fletching. He stumbled, stepping on something soft and wet, which sent him sprawling. Talia screamed. As he skidded to a rest on his rear, he saw it had been her frog, now sitting splat in the dirt. He couldn't tell if he had killed it or not. Talia looked at him with rage in her eyes and drew a throwing knife. Roland threw up his arms in an attempt to protect his face from flying steel, but nothing came. He scrambled to his feet and saw Maylin engaging both Talia and Anna with effortless grace. They struck, she spun. They kicked, she twisted. It looked like she was dancing. Roland watched, almost forgetting it was a fight, until Maylin planted a fist into the face of Anna, knocking her flat to the ground. Everything was happening so fast. Fights breaking out, the roofs in motion, scores of conquerors teeming toward them. Roland ran toward Maylin to help, though she didn't seem to need it. Her moves were so quick, G must be in active state. Then he saw the panda, sitting in the shadow of a stack of crates. Roland heard the release of arrows. He didn't falter, running toward Maylin. She adjusted something under her coat, faced the oncoming arrows and punched them out of the air. The crystal polar bear, Roland realized. Punch after punch, the arrows came at her and G, but Maylin's invisibly extended arms swiped them out of the air, knocking them off course before they could strike her spirit animal. "This way!" a voice said. Roland whirled. Adana gestured frantically. "This will only get worse," she said. "Come with me." "I can't," said Roland. "My friends—" "I need you to trust me now, Roland," said Adana. Panic lit her eyes, and she seemed as fierce and as beautiful as a bird of prey. "Now, Roland!" She disappeared around a large square building. Roland raced to the corner where his mother had gone, the noise of the battle prickling at his mind like a swarm of bees, no individual words distinguishable, until he heard a new voice, a shriek, something that reminded him of the sound he had heard a cat make once when struck by a passing cart. But this sound had words in it. "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!" the voice said. Roland whirled to look. And then there was fire. Chapter 16. Fire. Abeka didn't understand. Everything had been fine. Shane had promised he could get the conquerors to leave in peace if they traded him the crystal polar bear for the iron boar. "It isn't safe for any one group to hold them all," Shane had said, "no matter how well-intentioned. We just need to understand each talisman, but we won't steal the polar bear and leave you with none. I promise I won't let them." Power sharing made a kind of sense, especially if it would allow her friends to go free. But then Briggan had pounced, and arrows began to fly. When Connor ploughed into Shane, Shane was still holding Abeka's arm, and the 3 of them spiraled into a heap on the cobblestones below. Abeka felt like the end of a whip, riding a wave of movement that ended with her head smacking the ground. She rolled to one side, stunned. Trying to stand, her vision wavered and she dropped to one knee, blinking several times. She could feel the irritation of blood dripping down her ear, but the sight before her drove any other thoughts out of her mind. Men and women and animals everywhere, thrashing, swarming, fighting her friends. Her eyes were drawn to 4 or 5 animals surrounding G. 2 wild dogs, a common house cat, a goat and a stag were just staring at the panda. They had to be some of the conqueror's spirit animals, but they weren't attacking. A soldier barreled into G, pushing her sideways. He raised a sword. "Stop!" Abeka yelled, but the sounds of fury around her were too loud to be overcome. She saw one of the dogs bite the soldier's arm before Rebecca was knocked to the ground. A body had rolled into her, and she felt sweat or water or blood spatter her with the impact. She reached out, uncertain whether she was in danger, but wanting to help no matter who it was. It was Connor. He grabbed her hand.
"Are you okay? You're bleeding," he said, pointing to her right temple with a finger that looked like it had been bitten by a crocodile.
"You're bleeding too," she managed to say. Between her and the buildings of the village, were those archers on top? A figure stood, hand raised. The sun was behind him, washing out everything but a silhouette, yet Rebecca knew it was Shane. His hand was splayed out high, as if trying to hold back a sky filled with a dark swarm of birds. No, not birds. Arrows. Arrows arcing up, up, up to the sky, and now down. It seemed to Rebecca like hundreds of shots had been taken at the sun, and having failed to reach their destination, changed targets. To her. Instinct took over, and she seemed to no more think about calling Uraza out than she thought about making her own heart beat. Even as the leopard leaped forward, Rebecca leaped too. Her stride lengthened, her strength increased. Rebecca landed and rolled. The movement made her head spin, and she was certain that had she not been as hungry as she was, her last meal would have left her stomach. A dozen shafts plunged into the earth beside her, much fewer than the hundreds she'd thought she'd seen. She wasn't thinking straight. She felt herself start to shake as her body seemed to realize before her mind that when she'd leaped away from the arrows, Connor had not. He lay hunched over, head bowed, 3 arrows lodged in his back. He sat up suddenly and she gasped, stunned he was still alive.
"Rebecca!" Connor yelled. "We've got to get to Mei Lin! Get behind Mei Lin!"
He stood, dropping his pack, and the arrows with it.
"Only one got through," he said. "And just barely. I'll be okay."
There was another shout from Shane, and Rebecca saw he had 2 hands up this time, waving them desperately. There were more arrows, more than a dozen, more than they could dodge, more than they could live through. She closed her eyes. The heat of the sun on her face disappeared, and she opened her eyes to shadow, a huge shape blocking the sun. She heard the sound of dozens of arrows hitting a target different than intended, like an awkward chorus of rugs being beaten clean, and she found herself still alive and arrow-free. The shape between her and the archers moved, and the light caught a rippling of grey fur. Briggan, great Briggan, made huge by the slate elephant, was nearly the size of a real elephant. His fur was so thick, the arrows didn't seem to have penetrated his skin. Connor jumped on the wolf's back and raised his shepherd's crook like some kind of shepherd king going to war.
"Get on!"
he shouted. "I'll run with Uraza," Rebecca said. Connor seemed about to argue, but a dozen soldiers were running at him. The wolf growled a sound like the end of the world, and for a moment everything was quiet but for the whimpering of several animals that Rebecca could not see. Then the great wolf leaped at the soldiers, and it all began again. Briggan scattered the men, grabbing one between his powerful jaws. Rebecca heard a sharp crack, and the great wolf threw the body aside to snap at an approaching ox and its rider. Rebecca ducked behind some crates as more arrows flew. There seemed to be hundreds of conquerors, and no one was listening to Shane. He'd stop them if he could, she knew, but the frenzy of battle swept away all thought and reason. A great maned lion pounced. Rebecca only noticed a blur of yellow before Uraza's answering yowl raised the hairs on her arms. While the 2 cats fought, Rebecca knocked an arrow. The swirl of golden bodies made targeting the lion impossible. She glanced up and spotted more archers on the roof. She saw one turn, targeting Connor on the back of Briggan. Rebecca aimed and shot. The archer fell from the roof. Uraza bumped her knee. The lion was still. Rebecca put her hand on her spirit animal's head. "To Mei Lin," she said. They began to run. In her periphery, she saw Connor duck behind Great Briggan as more arrows shot from the tops of buildings, striking the wolf. It seemed impossible that his thick coat could deflect them all, and even the largest beast could be slain with sufficient ammunition and strategy. They needed strategy. In this kind of wild fighting, the side with the most fighters always won, and that meant she and her friends were sure to lose and die. Abeka looked frantically for Tariq and found him struggling in the grip of a man twice his size, his otter thrashing crazily, trying to escape the coils of a tremendous boa constrictor, aiming sharp bites at the snake's head. She ran toward the green cloak, staying low. She aimed her arrow, but afraid of hitting Tariq, she was only able to shoot his attacker in the knee. She and Uraza started for Mei Lin again, but was struck by a wave of force, a flat wall of wind that shoved her heavily off her feet, through the air several feet, and onto the ground yards from Mei Lin, who shouted something at her. The Zhongian was standing over the bodies of Zarif's 2 imposter girls, slapping wildly at the air like an old madwoman, oblivious to the lizard biting at her boot. Abeka thought Mei Lin had lost all sense, until she spotted the masses of arrows being shot at her from all sides. Mei Lin's face was tight with concentration, unable to do anything but focus on keeping herself and Ji behind her, defended from the onslaught. A badger flew at Abeka, stopped mid-air by Uraza. Mei Lin needed help. Abeka looked desperately at the battlefield. Where was Rolan? Was he dead? And Maya? "Abeka!" she heard Maya yell, as if in answer to her thought. Abeka spun to see the red-haired Yoran still standing at the edge of the docks, eyes wide like she had seen a whole army of ghosts. She was pointing to Abeka's left with a terrified hand. "Green cloak, filth!" Talia shouted, suddenly much closer and much less unconscious than Abeka had supposed. The conqueror twitched her arm, and a knife flew straight and true into Abeka's shoulder. For a moment, Abeka felt no pain, only rocked back by the force of the impact. She stared at the leather-wrapped hilt sticking out of her shoulder, stunned just long enough for Talia to kick a booted foot into Abeka's face. She fell back, and the imposter girl dropped roughly onto her chest and yanked the knife free. Then Abeka felt pain and screamed. "Louder!" Talia spat. Uraza, apparently finished with the badger, pounced, knocking Talia off Abeka. Abeka scrambled for her bow, but a heavy warhammer slammed down. Abeka rolled back in time, but the hammer shattered her bow. She looked up into the face of a huge man, his brown hair tied in 2 braids. His face was covered with scars, and his mouth was a cruel grimace. He lifted his hammer and struck again. Abeka scrabbled over a crate and just missed getting crushed. She heard Uraza's yowls, the calls of a leopard deep in a fight. Her cat could not come to her. Abeka pulled a dagger from her boot with her right hand. Her left shoulder stung with the knife wound, her left arm dangling. The braided man swung his hammer again. Abeka ducked, but he followed with a fist punch to the side of her head. Her vision clouded and her head dropped to the ground, eyes facing the battle. She wished she had fallen looking the other way, because here she saw the dead and nearly dead. She saw Mei Lin turn to look at her, a moment of inattention that rewarded her with an arrow to her thigh. She saw Connor, knocked from the back of Briggan, striking the wall of a nearby building hard and slumping to the ground. She saw Briggan flicker, return to his natural size and run limping to Connor's side. And in a huge mass, the conqueror army swarmed forward. There was a scream, and Abeka shuddered. She had hoped when the time came for her to die she would do it with dignity, but the scream was one of mad lunatic fear, an animal scream. This was not the way she wished to end. Abeka pressed her lips together to stop the shriek, and found they were shut already. The scream was not hers. "Stop it!" the voice yelled. By now that warhammer should have struck again, ending Abeka. She opened eyes that she had screwed shut and saw the soldier's braids blacken, turn into ash and blow away in the wind. "Stop it!" came the voice again. The soldier's face screwed up in a grimace of pain, raising his arms in an attempt to protect himself from an onslaught of heat. His sleeves started to char, catching fire like a log in a campfire. Abeka struggled to turn her head away from the sight. "Stop it!" the voice shrieked, and Abeka spotted Maya on the docks, eyes wide, lips pulled back to bare clenched teeth, her hand a rigid claw held high above her head. A wave of heat like a desert storm rolled across the dockside, the pulse of white light burning into Abeka's vision. Abeka held her arms in front of her head and opened her mouth to shout, but the air in her lungs was pulled from her in a hot gasp. She felt like she had looked into the face of the sun on a midsummer's day, and the sun had looked back and screamed. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the wave was gone. Maya lowered her arms and blinked. Everything was on fire. People, animals, buildings, crates. Conquerors ran in circles or toward the water, covered in flames, screaming. Abeka slapped at her clothing, hoping to douse flames that she soon found were not there. She drew back her hands, now smeared with a greasy grey ash. She stood, and something thumped off her belly and onto the ground. It was the steel head of the war hammer. The wooden shaft burned away, covered in the same greasy ash that covered Abeka. Ash, she now realized, that had once been a braided soldier. Chapter 17. The Bile. The docks were aflame. For a moment, Roland thought the conquerors had unleashed mythological fire demons upon them, as the flames danced and ran like men. Then he realized they were men, on fire. Many were running haphazardly to the shore, some rolling on the ground. Others, those that appeared not to be actively on fire, were running the other direction, away from the docks and the battle. Roland scanned the scene desperately for his friends and found them unburned, small islands in a sea of flame. Connor, mouth agape, watched a fiery shape plunge into the sea. Mei Lin, covered in ash, held a blackened arrow, tip still flaming, staring at it like a confused wizard holding an unfamiliar wand. Abeka was slumped against the only crates not on fire, her hand covering a bleeding shoulder. She was staring at the dock, where Maya was kneeling, as if she had collapsed. Her head was down, her whole body slumped except for her right arm, extended palm up in front of her. It was like an invisible force was holding that arm, keeping her from falling. A figure emerged from the water. Shane. He was burned and bedraggled, but very much alive. "Form up!" he shouted. A few others pulled themselves upright, and Roland noticed several heads appear on the rooftops. Far fewer than there had been before, but still many more than the 5 green cloaks. "Come on, Roland," Adana said, suddenly behind him. "I need to help my friends," he said. "No, you don't. Not by running into the fray and getting killed." She grabbed his wrist and pulled him, running. "What was that?" he gasped, slowing his pace. "The docks are on fire," his mother said. "We keep moving." "Did you know this was going to happen? Did your people set off a firebomb or something?" "Don't be ridiculous," she said. Roland opened his mouth to speak, but Adana squeezed his hand and looked in his eyes. "I only knew there would be a fight, and that it would turn ugly, and that your friend's side would have no chance. I didn't want you there." Essex was nowhere to be seen, but Roland knew she was telling the truth. People from the town pushed past them, running toward the blaze. They were carrying buckets. He stared at the flickering bit of dock he could see, mesmerized. "We should go help," he muttered. He felt strangely numb, as if he were just a boy in the audience of a town square trooper show, just watching, unable to take part. "The townspeople will help," Adana said. "The green cloaks must have caused it. They bring destruction wherever they go." Destruction, like an ice palace in ruins. "My friends," he mumbled. "Your friends?" Adana's voice broke. "I'm your mother, Roland. Please, son, I need you. Your friends, they use you. The Greencloaks are a violent bunch, intent on ruling the world, and liars all. Someone in your party told the Devourer you had Suka's talisman, and where you would cross back into Yora. All we had to do was wait.
No, none of them would.
How else could we have been waiting for you? Said Adana. You can't trust them, but you can trust me. I'm your blood. Roland shook his head. He could find no words. Let's go, Roland, she said. Not with Shane, not with the Greencloaks. Let's just go somewhere and be a family, away from all this. Her voice broke at the end, and her chin trembled. He nodded. The trooper show continued on behind him, with the battle and the burning as far away as a dream, but his mother held his hand, and her hand was warm. Only she felt real. He started to follow her down the alley, away from the noise. A cry from high above. Essex pierced the smoke-filled sky and streaked toward him. She landed on his shoulder and firmly clamped her talons onto him, steadying herself. It would seem Essex agrees, Adana said. With Essex on his shoulder, Roland's head cleared. He blinked, looked again into his mother's eyes, and nearly stumbled backward. For just a moment he swore her eyes changed. Her pupils narrowed, her irises lightened to the yellow of tarnished brass. Roland, is there...
What happened to you?
He asked, his voice trembling. Essex squeezed his shoulder, and he thought he saw faint black lines ghost about his mother, streaming away from her head, hands and feet. Roland took a step back. The smoky string drifting from Adana's left hand pulsed, and her arm shot forward spasmodically, gripping Roland's wrist.
Let go!
He shouted, and tugged his arm back.
What's the matter with you? Stop it!
Adana's arm flopped with his effort, like the slackened arm of a doll, but her grip was like a vice. He winced with the pain. Any more pressure and he was sure his bones would break. Please, she said, teeth clenched, as if it were she feeling the pain, and then closed her eyes. He watched her brow furrow and the black lines flickered. She let go, breathing heavily as if she'd just run a mile. It's not what you think. Essex shifted her weight, and Roland realized the black trails behind his mother were gone. He hadn't imagined them, had he? No, those snake eyes. He'd seen those eyes.
Something more is going on. Something is clinging to you, inside you.
Adana shook her head despairingly. I didn't know, she said. I only took the bile to make the sickness go away. I wanted to be myself again. I wanted to be your mother. Tears wobbled in her eyes. But now I'm less myself than I've ever been. I do things. Her head lowered, as if she didn't quite have the energy to hold it up any longer. It's like I'm a passenger in my own body. Since taking the bile, sometimes it controls me. The bile. It was like someone had taken a blindfold off of him that he didn't know he was wearing. The bile, he thought with revulsion. The magical, cure-all bile. Roland touched the spot where she'd gripped his wrist, marks of her fingernails still raw and red there. But you fought it, he said. The lines had flickered as she let go. You can break the control. Just now I saw you do it. She stared at him, a spark of hope in eyes otherwise empty of anything but despair. I try, I really do, but it's so hard. Roland took his mother's hand and pulled her up.
You never had help before, but you do now.
A smile lit her face, and she leaned her face down to his until their foreheads touched. I love you, Roland, she said. They stood this way until a bright flash in Roland's peripheral vision caught his attention. He tried to draw back, but found Adana was holding so tightly he couldn't fully disengage. Mother, he started, and realized there was a whine in his voice that he had only ever heard from spoiled rich kids in carriages on the streets of Concorba.
You can let go now, he
he said, and then saw her face was frozen in something that looked a lot like fear. She was shaking. Her whole body had locked up, and she seemed to expend vast amounts of energy just to open her mouth in a whisper. "Run!" she rasped, and as he watched, the pupils of her eyes enlarged, nearly overtaking her now yellow irises. Her grip slackened, releasing him. He fell to the ground with the suddenness of it, and Essex flapped off his shoulder to avoid being toppled. Adana was standing where she had been, frozen in place, slowly mouthing something he could not hear. He stood, and Essex dropped back onto his shoulder. When she did so, he was almost blinded by the appearance of hundreds of streams of pulsing black light driving into his mother's back. Her arm slithered slowly into her cloak. Wickerus materialized and immediately flapped up to hover above his mother's head like a dark cloud.
"Mother," he said, "you need to concentrate. You can—"
he started, but was interrupted by her scream.
"Run!"
she yelled, and flung a knife at his face. Essex seized Roland's hair in her talons and tugged just enough for the knife to sail past his ear, but by then Adana was on him. Her fingernails raked across his cheek, and he felt something hard slam into his ribs. Essex screeched, and her beak drew back a chunk of meat from the soft flesh of Adana's hand. Wickerus let out an enraged caw and took to the sky, Essex leaping to catch him in a clash of feathers. Roland scrambled backward, gasping for breath. His mother advanced awkwardly, as if on borrowed legs, her hand dripping blood onto the street. Her snake eyes stared without any hint of emotion, her mouth frozen in a terrifying grimace. Her voice gurgled from her throat like a thing trying to remember how to speak. Forward she lurched. Roland tried to speak to her, managing only a wheezed cough, but by then she had leaped atop him. Her knee landed in his stomach, knocking out his breath and bending him in half, vomit rising in his throat. Her hands clamped around his neck. He gasped for air that would not come and clawed weakly at her hands. He could feel hot wetness running down onto his chest, soaking his tunic. Whether it was his blood or Adana's, he couldn't tell. Her teeth were bared, her mouth foaming like a rabid dog's. But even so, as the edges of his vision grew dark, he could see tears falling from those inhuman yellow eyes. Roland's arms grew heavy and his brain fogged. He began to wonder why he was struggling so hard. His fingers loosened from the hands around his throat, and his eyes rolled to the side. The building he lay beside was made all of grey stone, except for a small high window which was of red brick. The mix of the colours reminded Roland of how old meat drains of blood. He closed his eyes to sleep. And then air. Beautiful, smoke-stained and dust-ridden air. He could breathe. His mother had let go and rolled off of him. She was thrashing on the ground, batting at the mass of talons and feathers clamped to her head. Her blows grew weaker, and under such an attack, her eyes would not last long. "Essex, stop!" he tried to yell, but it came out a rasped whisper. Even so, the falcon let go of Adana's face and took flight. Adana's body collapsed to the ground, shuddering. Her eyes had survived, but the rest of her head and neck were covered in deep cuts and scratches. One wound below her jaw was bleeding profusely. Her cloak lay crumpled in a heap near his feet, and Roland grabbed it and pressed the mass to her wound.
"You're going to be okay," he said. "Once the bleeding stops, you're going to be okay."
His breathing was too shallow, and his speech was too fast. His hands were shaking. A part of his brain knew he was in shock, knew he needed to stop and think to figure out what he could do in a rational way. But nothing except what he was doing right now seemed possible, at least not until he felt the sharp prick of a knife's blade in his forearm. Adana was holding a throwing knife to his arm, just holding it there. He pulled his arm back and she dropped the knife deliberately onto the ground in front of him. Her mouth moved in silent words, her yellow eyes brightened from the colour of tarnished brass to that of the heart of a flame.
"Roland!"
someone shouted. "Maylin?" He couldn't tell. He leaned closer to his mother. He felt like he really needed to hear what she was trying to say. Footsteps sounded behind him.
Rolan, are you okay?
Connor. That was Connor. He put his ear to Adana's lips.
Kill me,
she whispered. Roland stumbled backward, slipped on the knife at his feet, and landed on his backside. She didn't stand, just shook violently, as if her every muscle was working hard to keep from attacking again. Her eyes flickered yellow, pupils dilating again, and her gaze darted to where the weapon lay.
Can you run? Connor was asking. We need to go. I mean, really, really need to go.
Roland felt himself being pulled, first to his feet and then away from his mother. Roland stared at her as he went. He saw her eyes close, and he thought maybe that was it, that was the right thing to do, and he closed his too. His head felt light and wobbly, his body as distant as the sounds of battle. He tripped and fell, deciding that a nap right now made a lot of sense, except that someone was slapping his face. He opened his eyes and felt hands on either side of his face. Roland! Roland! Maylin. She was holding his face. That seemed sweet. She was right in front of him, her face in his. It was like a painting, a portrait of Maylin in front of a furry black and white flag. No, not a flag. Gee. He looked up and their eyes connected. Some of the smoke in his brain cleared. Roland, look at me! Maylin shouted. He blinked. She pointed toward the shore where a boat was casting off amid burned timber. That is a boat, she said, and turned his face back to hers. They were inches away from each other. He thought he liked that. We need to get to that boat, now! And then she slapped him again. He stood up and stumbled after her. Roland was vaguely aware of things flying past his head as he ran. Arrows? He was running down the pier behind Connor and Maylin, the only one not completely demolished by fire. A few people waved encouragingly from the boat. Something stung him in the calf and he stumbled but kept going. He was running out of pier. He saw Connor, Briggan, Abeka, Maya, and Tariq in the boat. Maylin jumped in. She turned to look at him. He was at least 4 feet from the edge of the pier, and the boat was 4 feet beyond that, and increasing. No way could he jump more than 8 feet, not without the granite ram.
Run!
Someone yelled from the boat. Maybe several people. Someone else shouted, Jump! And so he did, realizing in mid-leap that the person who had shouted had been himself. He flew through the air, reaching out, but knowing he was too far to make it. As he braced himself for a plunge into the cold sea, something caught him, something invisible. It felt like he was sitting on a cushion of air and was being drawn to the boat. He saw Maylin's hands outstretched, palms upward, her face screwed up in concentration. The crystal talisman around her neck was glowing. She had caught him. Roland readied himself to tumble onto the boat when something knocked him from Maylin's talisman-enhanced hands, slamming him into the ocean. Freezing water stung his nose. He gurgled and struggled, fighting his way to the surface. He gasped for breath, and Tariq and Maylin were there, reaching in the water to pull him out. Their hands were on his wrists when a second attack knocked the air out of him. He went under again. He clawed his way up, but the boat was moving away. Maylin reached out, yelling for him to swim, swim! He thrashed in the water and suddenly felt a tug upward. Maylin's ghost grasp had hold of his shoulders and was pulling him out and toward the boat. He was nearly there when Wickerus sliced through the air at Maylin, grasping at the crystal polar bear with his feet. Maylin screamed, and Roland dropped back into the icy waters. Essex dove down with a screech, talons out, going for the raven's eyes. The raven let go of the talisman and flew away, but it had done its damage. The cord around Maylin's neck was cut, and the crystal polar bear slid from her neck and into the waters below. Roland dove, aiming himself at the sparkling crystal talisman as it fell. It didn't occur to him that he was freezing, that he was so tired from running and fighting and bleeding that he was just seconds from passing out and making those icy waters his grave. In a burst of instinct, he simply knew it was the right thing to do, and that he would be just as miserable and empty in the cold air as in the cold water, so he might as well do the right thing. He could see the bear falling, still faintly aglow. Everything seemed to slow. The talisman, his kicking legs, his fading thoughts. He stretched his arm, trying to grab the talisman before it was gone, just managing to catch hold of it with numb fingers. He held the crystal bear to him, his energy gone, his goal achieved. He closed his eyes. Perhaps now he could sleep. A tremendous force slammed into Roland, rocking his mind awake enough to clamp down on lungs about to take a deep breath of ocean. He flailed and felt his hand break the surface of the water. His head followed, and he gasped for air. The fog in his brain cleared enough for him to realize his hands were empty. The talisman was gone. He started to go under again when hands reached him. The boat had rowed around, and Tariq and Maylin pulled him back in.
No!
He coughed seawater, struggling to speak.
No! Put me back! The talisman!
It's too late,
said Tariq. A huge grey creature, like the great beast version of the horror dog of the Ardu, was swimming away from their boat. One of its elephantine tusks had hooked the crystal polar bear. It swam to the far shore and leaped out of the water on its belly, offering the talisman to a man in a black hood. He took the talisman and held it up, showing it proudly to Shane and a couple dozen other conquerors on the edge of the burned docks.
No!
said Roland.
No, no, no!
He rose, trying to jump in after it, but Tariq held him fast.
It's done, Roland,
said Tariq.
Don't sacrifice your life for what's already lost.
Roland struggled, his eyes on the shore. The conquerors gloated over the crystal polar bear that he and his friends had fought so hard for. The great grey-tusked beast stared back with a face as sharp as a spear. And Adana, his mother, watched him with her dark eyes. Her face was covered in scratches, blood dripping off her chin, down her neck. She lifted her hand as if she would... Shane approached Adana, putting a kind arm around her shoulder, and her hand dropped. The two of them watched the boat recede, sadly, their shoulders stooped, their heads bowed. Suddenly, Roland was shuddering with sobs he didn't know had been building. He pushed his palms against his aching heart and sobbed. Tariq's arms were still around him, not holding him back now, just holding him. Tariq patted his back, pressed Roland's head to his shoulder, not speaking. When the sobs slowed, Roland still kept his face hidden, afraid to see their faces, to know if his friends thought him weak, careless, foolish. He wiped his face off with his scarf and sat down, Tariq sitting beside him.
"A walrus,"
Roland whispered.
"Wouldn't you know it'd be a walrus? I know for sure now. I hate walruses."
The other kids laughed, the sound honest and nervous and full of pain.
"Roland, are you okay?"
Connor asked.
"That woman, she almost killed you."
Roland just stared into the distance. So many things found and lost so quickly. He'd lost the talisman. He'd lost his mother again. Had she wanted to come with him there at the end? But even if she did, she was under the bile's control. Oh, the conquerors touted it as a cure-all, but forgot to mention how at any moment anyone who drank the bile could become the devourer's puppet. She said she'd gone back to that house in Concorba where she'd left him on the steps, waiting for a miraculous family who never claimed him. She'd gone back for him. And he'd go back for her. Somehow, he would save her from the bile's control, if the only way was killing the devourer with his own hands. Roland rubbed his face. He wasn't crying anymore, but his eyes were hot and stinging.
"Something happened to you,"
Tariq said.
"Something more than losing the talisman."
Roland shook his head. He didn't want to speak.
All this struggle and hardship must feel overwhelming, Tariq said. I believe you have known more loss than I can imagine. Life is full of loss. I have learned that what matters is how we fill the hole that the loss leaves behind. The Devourer is a great hole. He tries to consume the world to fill his loss, but domination will not satisfy his hungering need for wholeness.
Roland saw Mei Lin put a hand over her face to hide her anguish. Roland's heart hurt even worse. Mei Lin would understand if he told her about Adana. Connor, too, he believed. Tariq would comfort him. Abeka would be silent, but not judge him. With a start, he realized he knew how they all would react. This was his crew now. This was beginning to be his family. But he didn't feel capable yet of telling the story. The pain was still as fresh as an arrow just entering his heart.
Use what you have lost, Tariq said. Draw from it. Swing from that loss, and each punch will have more power.
Roland nodded, but he didn't feel much like punching. He slumped to the boat's deck, sitting with his knees pulled to his chest. Between the legs of everyone else standing, he saw another figure huddled directly opposite him. Maya. He almost didn't recognize her, with her red hair burned almost completely away, a pink wound across one cheek. The normally lively blue eyes were vacant. He couldn't tell if she was looking at him or not.
"The fire," he whispered. "It was her."
Connor dropped to one knee beside him.
"She saved us. There were 100 conquerors, more maybe, each with a spirit animal. After Maya blew up..."
Connor paused, his eyes clouding with some memory Roland did not have.
"After that, a large part of their army was just gone."
Roland saw Abeka sit down next to Maya and take her hand, saying something to her as Maya continued to stare forward.
100 or more.
Roland pressed shut his eyes.
The conquerors were serious about this. "And prepared enough to know we were coming," Connor said.
He was looking at Mei Lin, who was holding G's paw in an affectionate way that Roland had never seen her do before, as G licked at a wound on Mei Lin's leg. Everyone looked pretty beat up. Burns, blood-stained clothes, horror still in their eyes. He lifted a hand to his neck, felt the tender bruises forming there, shaped like his mother's fingers. Tears began to well up, and a part of him wondered if all that sea water he'd swallowed trying not to drown was streaming out of his eyes. Maya's empty eyes found his. Maybe it would be better to be burned out from the inside, he thought, to be emptied of thought and feeling, and be as alone on the inside as he was in the world. He closed his eyes. Numbness. The invitation was alluring, the promise of never feeling again. Death might feel as welcoming as a warm bed. G left Mei Lin and ambled over to Maya, who looked at the panda, a little hope in her eyes. G pressed her forehead against Maya's, and the girl's eyelids flickered, closed. Her body collapsed into slumber, her face at peace. But Roland's limbs trembled, rejecting the lure of sleep and forgetfulness. G looked at him with her peaceful silver eyes, and Roland shook his head. Even though he chose to stay awake and ache with the memory of all that had happened, as if the pain would keep his mother alive and well, he didn't know how much more he could bear. His heart felt ripped to tatters, his body beat up and abandoned. A sudden weight on his forearm, a prickly grip on his skin. Essex looked at him with an unblinking eye. He wasn't ready to tell the others, but Essex knew. She knew about Adana and her raven. She knew how Roland's heart had been ripped, half mended, and then ripped again. She knew what he did, what he said, and of those things left unspoken, all the details of the broken mess of his whole self. And still she hadn't abandoned him. The cold wind picked up, ruffling her brownish gold feathers. Roland loosened the neck of his coat, exposing the skin. He lifted his chin. An invitation. Essex leaned in and became a mark over his heart.